The experience often begins without a clear signal, without a dramatic shift or a visible turning point, but rather as a quiet pattern that repeats itself across months and years, where income increases just enough to create relief, but never enough to create distance from financial pressure. And this pattern is what many refer to as the middle-class trap, not because it is defined by income level alone, but because it is defined by the relationship between earnings, lifestyle, and the invisible systems that shape spending behavior. Imagine an individual who receives a steady paycheck, pays rent or a home loan, manages groceries, transportation, utilities, and occasional leisure, and from the outside everything appears stable, even responsible. Yet beneath that surface there is a constant balancing act, where each financial decision is not about growth, but about maintenance. And over time, this creates a subtle psychological shift, where stability begins to feel like progress, even when no real financial leverage is being built. The core concept of the middle-class trap lies in the alignment between rising income and rising expenses, where every increment in earnings is quickly absorbed by lifestyle upgrades, often justified as necessary improvements, such as moving to a better neighborhood, upgrading devices, increasing social spending, or taking on larger financial commitments. And while each individual decision may appear rational, together they form a system where income and expenses grow in parallel, preventing the accumulation of surplus capital. Psychologically, this pattern is reinforced by what behavioral economists describe as hedonic adaptation, where improvements in lifestyle quickly become the new baseline, reducing their perceived value over time and encouraging further consumption to maintain the same level of satisfaction. And this creates a loop where financial progress is measured not by net worth or asset growth, but by the ability to sustain a certain standard of living, even if that standard requires continuous income dependency. When we examine the mathematics behind this system, the structure becomes clearer, because wealth accumulation is not driven primarily by income, but by the gap between income and expenses. And if that gap remains small or inconsistent, then even a relatively high income will struggle to translate into long-term financial stability. Whereas a modest but consistent surplus, when invested over time, begins to create compounding effects that gradually reduce reliance on active income. Consider two individuals earning similar salaries, where one allows expenses to expand with each raise, while the other maintains a stable cost structure. And over a period of 10 to 15 years, the difference between them is not merely in savings, but in optionality, because the individual with surplus capital gains access to investment opportunities, risk tolerance, and time flexibility, while the other remains bound to the necessity of continuous work to sustain their lifestyle. From a systemic perspective, the middle-class trap is not entirely accidental, because modern economic structures are designed to encourage consumption, offering easy access to credit, promoting aspirational lifestyles through media, and normalizing long-term financial commitments such as EMIs, which effectively convert future income into present spending. And while these systems provide convenience and comfort, they also reduce financial resilience by limiting the ability to accumulate uncommitted capital. Over time, this dynamic creates a situation where individuals feel financially active but structurally constrained, where they are constantly earning, spending, and upgrading, yet rarely stepping outside the cycle. And this is where the trap becomes less about money itself and more about identity, because financial decisions begin to reflect social expectations rather than long-term strategy, reinforcing the cycle further. Breaking this pattern does not require extreme frugality or sudden lifestyle rejection, but rather a gradual shift in how financial progress is defined, moving away from visible consumption and toward invisible accumulation, where the focus is placed on increasing the gap between income and expenses in a sustainable way, and then consistently allocating that gap toward assets that generate future optionality. This shift is subtle but significant, because it changes the role of income from something that must be fully consumed into something that can be partially preserved and multiplied. And as this process continues over time, the individual begins to experience a different financial reality, where decisions are no longer constrained by immediate necessity, but guided by long-term positioning. In this sense, the middle-class trap is not a permanent condition, but a default pathway, one that operates quietly unless it is consciously examined, and the moment that examination begins, the system itself becomes visible, allowing for small but meaningful adjustments that gradually alter its trajectory. The transition out of this trap is not marked by a single breakthrough, but by a series of consistent choices that compound over time, where financial stability evolves into financial flexibility, and eventually into a state where money is no longer just something that is earned and spent, but something that is structured, directed, and allowed to work beyond immediate consumption. And perhaps the most important realization is that this shift is less about how much is earned and more about how the system surrounding that income is designed. Because in the long run, it is the structure of decisions, not the size of paychecks, that determines whether someone remains within the cycle or gradually moves beyond it.